Welcome to C2GTalk, a series of one-on-one interviews with influential practitioners and thought leaders to explore the governance challenges raised by emerging approaches to alter the climate. I'm Mark Turner, C2G's Director of Communications, and with us today we have Franz Perrez, the Swiss Ambassador for the Environment, who's the head of the International Affairs Division at the Swiss Federal Office for the Environment. In this capacity, he represents Switzerland at all important international negotiations in the area of the environment, such as on climate change. Welcome.
Thanks, Mark, and it's a pleasure to be here with you, and I'm looking forward to our discussion.
Fantastic. Well, let's start with Switzerland itself, which has long time been a leader in climate action, including on plans to achieve net zero emissions. In achieving net zero, how important will it be to remove carbon dioxide already in the atmosphere, in addition to rapid action on cutting emissions?
Well, I think what is important, carbon dioxide removal, that the IPCC has shown that will be an option that we will have probably to use if you want to come on a pathway towards 1.5 degrees Celsius. But this is certainly not the preferred or priority option. The most important thing remains to mitigate. And so we have really to bring down all emissions to zero. That's the only way forward. So carbon capture, negative emission, that's only an additional element to compensate for what we have not been able to achieve in the past, and for the very, very, very few emissions that we will not be able to prevent for the future. But it's not an alternative to very ambitious, very robust mitigation measures. And that's where our priority is at this moment.
Of course. So you recently reached a first of its kind, I guess, offsetting agreement with Peru. So in the context of what you just said, I'm interested, how important do you see arrangements such as that in achieving our climate and other sustainable development goals? And how does that play into mitigation, not emitting and removing and the rest of it?
Well, I think an important starting point for these agreements, as you have now concluded with Peru and others will follow very soon, is the notion that these efforts to reduce emission, not at home, but in other countries, are not a compensation for lack of action or for lack of domestic action. I think that is absolutely clear. That is not a way to avoid very ambitious and robust actions at home, but it is something that could be done in addition to the maximum emission reduction feasible at home at the domestic level. That is the approach. And that is also the concept of Article 6. The starting point is each country has to do the maximum it can with regard to emission reduction at home. But then Article 6 offers a tool to do more and also to be recognized for this doing more by working together with a partner to help that partner to reduce emissions in the country of the partner that would not have been able to be reduced if that cooperation had taken place. So the additionality of that emission reduction, not only to the maximum efforts at home, but also to what the partner country can do by itself, is a very important criteria. The additionality, the non-double counting, that's also a principle enshrined in the Paris Agreement. And then last but not least, the environmental integrity and the promotion of sustainable development. And with that agreement with Peru and the others that will follow, with Ghana and so on, we really want to create a framework that is living up to these standards, that is putting them in operation, and it's certainly not an effort to reduce our domestic ambition, but it's something to complement and to do more than we would be able to do it as Switzerland alone.
Of course. So you mentioned a couple of the issues, additionality, double counting. Can you say a little bit more about the governance challenges around these kind of arrangements and how you address them and how you discuss them? Perhaps taking the Peru agreement as an example, or in more general, how do you navigate through some of these governance challenges?
Well, some of the governance challenges are easier to solve and others are more complicated. I think the easier is when it comes to no double counting. That is easier. You implement or create a robust transparency system where you really adjust the inventory of the country that is transferring its MOS to another country. That is something that is not too complicated, neither under 6.2 nor under 6.4 on the Paris Agreement. And then there are other elements which are a little bit more complicated, but still, I think, easy to handle, like, for example, ensuring environmental integrity. And for Switzerland, environmental integrity means more than just having permanence, ensuring permanence, additionality, and the measurability. It means also that the activities that are undertaken to reduce emissions respect also other environmental concerns, that they are in line with other environmental norms, be it biodiversity, be it clean air, be it water, so that we do not create another problem by solving one problem. But this can also be solved bilaterally, and we have mechanisms in place to make sure that this is in place. The third element foreseen by the Paris Agreement, promotion of sustainable development, is a little bit more complex because sustainable development can mean a lot, but we found there also, I think, a good solution by indicating that it has to be in line with the sustainable sustainable development strategies and policies of both of the partners, of both of the partners. And one element that is really dear to us, we have to make really sure that these activities do respect human rights. I think that is also an element, but these elements you can write in and implement mechanism to make sure that they are respected. I think the biggest challenge is to create arrangement that is targeting the space in where you will launch activities in the right area. You don't want to create an incentive in the host country not to formulate an ambitious NDC. So you have to make sure that whatever activity you implement under that agreement are done in that space that is for this period, for this moment, out of the reach of an ambitious NDC. And I think that is the most complicated for both partners. Also for the host countries, that's the most difficult thing, to find the right area where cooperation can allow for additional activities that will not be able to be done without such arrangements.
Absolutely. So if we could go briefly on to the sort of idea of carbon dioxide removal, which we've touched on, which has perhaps a relationship with offsetting as well, but goes further. Switzerland, for example, is home to Climeworks. It's an innovator in direct air capture, which is one technology-based approach to carbon dioxide removal. What can or should governments, and based on your experience, do to support this kind of innovation, and what are the things you need to look out for there?
First of all, we think it is really important that innovations like the one that was developed by Climeworks take place. We need innovation to solve certain problems. But at the same time, what is equally important is always to be aware that innovations may also involve significant uncertainties. So we know from IPCC, we know that carbon dioxide removal will be a measure that we will need in order to come on the 1.5 degree pathway. But we also have a lot of indications that certain technologies, be it carbon dioxide removal and even more when it comes to soil aeration management, could imply significant risks.
Yes.
Also some carbon removal technologies like ocean fertilization, for example, but also large-scale afforestation projects can have a significant environmental and social impacts that we do not yet fully understand.
Yes.
So I think whenever, on the one side, being open for new ideas and new approaches and new technologies, we also have to undertake every effort to make sure that we understand potential risk of that. And that is one of our biggest concerns, that because we feel we need carbon dioxide removal, we are just moving blindly and over-optimistically into technologies that then at the end could create other problems. That's the reason why I think the first thing is always we have to make a robust assessment with the knowledge that we have today, what could be the impacts, and also try to close the knowledge gaps and uncertainties that we have with regard to negative impacts. If you are not taking that part of the coin very seriously, then we are also not credible when we are at the same time willing to look for options and new technologies that can perhaps have the potential to bring critical elements for the solutions that we need.
Yes. So how do we talk about learning and addressing these risks But how does that happen in practice? What are the kind of techniques and governance techniques you can bring to bear to start to make those assessments? And starting on a national level, and then we'll talk a little bit later about international level as well. But what does it look like to learn and make these assessments in practice?
I think that is one of the daily business of governments, of course, to make such assessments, to make risk assessments, potential assessments. And that is part of our daily business, of course, before the policies, because you always want to base your policies on sound science as much as that is possible, and you also want to be aware of possible uncertainties. So there were studies undertaken already by the Royal Academy in England. We in Switzerland just recently undertook quite a comprehensive assessment through the EPFL, the Technology Institute in Lausanne, to try to understand what are potential risks. And these studies, all of these risk studies involve, of course, researchers from all around the world. So we have to support this kind of assessments. That's the only way to close our knowledge gap, and that's the only way to create a framework and enabling and make sure that we are moving to the right direction.
Right. So perhaps in the same thing, in 2019, Switzerland co-sponsored a resolution on geoengineering, and we can talk about that term, and its governance at the 4th UN Environment Assembly. That resolution called, amongst other things, for the United Nations Environment Programme to prepare an assessment of the status of these technologies, in particular carbon dioxide removal technologies and solar radiation management. Why did Switzerland take this action? Was there a link between your national experience, what you'd learnt, and then seeing the need for such action at an international level?
The reason for the motivation for that was that we were really concerned. We were concerned that there might be a tendency to move too quickly to new approaches without making a sound assessment of both potentials and risks. We thought that the knowledge base is not sufficient and that some might be over-enthusiastic. And some of these approaches could have significant international impacts. And when international impact and negative international impacts, not only the positive side of perhaps slowing down global warming, because we also have very significant negative international impacts. And there's always a risk that these externalities, if they are not transparent, that they are overseen or neglected or perhaps even purposely overseen. And therefore we thought we need more than national assessments. We need more than assessments by the Royal Academy, by Swiss academic institutes, by the Science Academy in other countries. We need also a common understanding, an international common understanding of the potential risks. That's the only way forward in order to create a certain assurance that it would be difficult to start to employ technologies that could lead to many negative consequences. And we were exploring internally, well, who could do such an assessment? Who would be the best body for the national body to provide an assessment that has then also that credibility and authority that could then guide further political decision-making. And we have realized that within the UN system, you have many bodies with a lot of scientific expertise. IPCC, EPES, there are many institutions like that. But all these institutions, they have a special angle to look at certain issues. IPCC look at issues from a climate change perspective, EPES from a biodiversity perspective. But these technologies captured under the term geoengineering or climate altering technologies and measures, they imply all these dimensions. They have a dimension on climate, on biodiversity, on water quality, whatever. And there's one institution in the UN system that is ensuring that broad environmental picture, that is also looking at social consequences, and that is also a robust expertise and credentials of providing such assessments. And that's UNEP. UNEP did many assessments that then have later been instrumental to trigger policy actions and to guide political decision-making. So that is the core mandate of UNEP. And that's the reason why we thought UNEP should be the body to make such an assessment, to collect information, just to allow for a better common understanding of the challenges, of potentials, but also of possible governance needs that such technologies might need.
And in the run-up to this and talking with other countries about it, you just now have, to some extent in the framing of it, focused on risks. Is there a degree to which that was also balanced by opportunities, or is it, how do you sort of balance talking about risks and potential opportunities when you...
I think you always have to balance risks and opportunities, but the problem is that we too often see the opportunities because we might directly benefit from them, and we don't see the risks because someone else will have to bear these risks. And that's the reason we were concerned that the focus is too much on opportunities. Some might even believe the opportunity is so big that we don't have to change our consumption and production patterns, and that we can continue to act as in the past because the opportunities of these technologies might be so tremendous. Without seeing, our concern was really that the risks are overseen, and therefore that was a motivation for it. But you should also not only look at risks, of course. You have to, at the end, you have to make a balance. But at this moment, we think that the most important thing is to have a better understanding also of the risks and not only of the opportunities.
You also managed to convince a number of other countries to support this action, to co-sponsor this resolution. Can you say a little bit about how you went about talking to those countries and bringing them along?
Well, we were talking to countries that in many other environmental areas have a similar approach like we do. Colleagues we are working with in other areas, be it chemicals, be it climate change, be it biodiversity, or UNEP in general. So that was one motivation to approach certain countries. And another approach was also, of course, to use the Environmental Integrity Group. That is our climate change negotiation group, and all the members of that group were part co-sponsoring that resolution. And then we had also the desire to, our objective was not to have a group of co-sponsors that is as big as possible. Our objective was really to be representative, meaning that we have smallest emitters, very big emitters, developed countries, developing countries, and we were pretty proud also of being able really to bring a group together where you really can find nearly every perspective that is relevant in that context. And with that, we thought that gave a clear signal that this is not a concern of one particular perspective. It is a concern in principle of everybody to have a better understanding of the risks, potential, and also possible governance needs for each of these different technologies that can be captured under the term geoengineering or climate-altering technologies and measures.
And to bring this group of co-sponsors or supporters together, did you find there was, in sort of practical terms, the art of diplomacy, was there a moment at which one country or another country suddenly went for it and convinced other countries to also co-sponsor? How's the dynamic of that? Because I imagine it might be a little nerve-wracking for some countries to put their head above the parapet on this. And well, obviously you guys have led, but how does the dynamic of putting together a group of people to help you on a resolution like this?
I think you always need partners who are, first of all, sharing the same concern, so convinced that this is the right thing to do. If someone is not really convinced, the partner would not be willing to go ahead. You want partners who are also willing to show their face and who are also willing to speak out. And we were able to find such partners. So we had a lot of interactions. There was a big trust within the group, between the teams. So that means that's important, so that you're also willing to say things where you're not absolutely sure, just to test ideas, to criticize things and ideas without getting the feeling that someone is not really sharing the basic concern. So this interaction was very helpful. It was very, very dynamic also, and it involved a lot of engagement of all of these actors that have been supporting that idea.
So in the end, the resolution did not pass, but reading through the analysis afterwards, I think everybody agrees it was successful in catalyzing a pretty significant debate. And, these discussions that emerged from that continue to have repercussions and effects today. Could you say a little bit about, how you saw the outcome at UNEA for what led to what happened? Just talk us through a little bit about the process.
Well, that is, of course, now a very subjective perspective, how I perceived as one of the proponents and of the co-sponsor of that resolution, how I perceived that these negotiations. We were we had the impression there are three groups, more or less, three kind of reactions. They were not formal groups, but you could cluster the reactions into three categories. There were those who understood our concern, shared it, and therefore supported it. And then there were those who were interestedly concerned that such an assessment could be seen as an enabling framework for technologies that might be risky. So we were concerned that such an assessment could have as a consequence that it would facilitate the deployment of technologies that we might at the end not really want to be deployed. The interaction with that group was helpful, and I think we were able then also to show to that group that is certainly not what the idea is behind it. It was really to develop a better understanding, precisely to also develop frameworks that are constraining if there's need for it. But that group, I think at the end, reflected, that view was reflected most by bringing into that draft resolution an explicit reference to the notion of precaution. Yes. By saying that we're doing all that assessment under the overall political approach of precaution. That was very important for them to put the right framing about that effort. Then there was another group of countries where we had the impression their concern was just the opposite. They were afraid of triggering a process that leads to the bringing together scientific information that then could lead over to a political debate that then at the end could limit certain technologies. Right. And I think that was that group then that also at the end of the negotiations was not willing to go ahead with that proposal. That we took up all the different concerns. Some of the concerns expressed by many was, for example, we don't want to have one category of having only geoengineering. That was never our objective. We always wanted, we think we need a specific analysis of each of the different areas. We took that on board. Some said we don't want to be so specific about governance. We want to focus more on risk and potential at the moment. We took that also on board, or tried to put that on board in new revisions of the draft. But at the end, I think the last draft reflected all these concerns in a very balanced manner, but then it still met objection. I think of those who were afraid of creating something that could limit their space of freedom of maneuvering in future.
Interesting. So I just wanted to pick up one of those because it's obviously an issue that we often deal with in our communications, is the concept of geoengineering itself. And under that is a whole set of potential approaches, some to do with large-scale carbon dioxide removal, some to do with solar radiation modification. And within each of those umbrellas of approaches, there are many different potential techniques and technologies that could be deployed. We, over time, I guess, have moved towards talking about carbon dioxide removal separately from solar radiation modification, but people still use this term geoengineering as well for various reasons. Can you say anything about, how important do you think these terminology issues are in getting governors together, in helping to create shared understanding at the international level? How much are some of these terms getting in the way? I'd just be very interested in some of your insights on that.
I have two perspectives on that. I think on the one side, from a rational perspective, you would assume that these terms are not as difficult. They should not be a real problem as long as you have a clear understanding what they meant and what the consequences are. But interestingly, in reality, that's not the case. It's, as you said, many of these terms have a certain connotation or create a connotation which some like and others don't like. That's not only the term of geoengineering. For example, like green economy, a term at once that got really a problematic term for some for totally different reasons that are out of the meaning of the concept. So sometimes some partners, of course, also use an approach to criticize a term, not because they don't like the term, but because they want to convey a certain message, which might be absolutely not correct when you look only at the term. So geoengineering, as a term, as we used it, we just used it as a broad chapeau term with a clear understanding that under this term, you can use geoengineering, or now it's more used climate alternate technology and measures. There are many different technologies under that broader term, which are totally different potential, totally different techniques, totally different risks. Some risks might be very local, some might be of global dimension, like if you do, I think, solar radiation management, that's something totally different.
Yes.
Having one term, we've thought the benefit of having one term is to highlight, listen, there's a broad kind of actions which are not mitigation, which can be seen as a tool to address some of the challenges of climate change. And they are all linked with interfering with how the climate works. And we don't attach a value judgment to that term. For many, geoengineering has become a negative value judgment linked to it. So now we are using more CATM because some believe that is less negative connotated. But at the end, the term is a term. What is important is that we have a common understanding. We want to look at each of these technologies separately. But at the same time also that we say, yes, we want to look at each of these terms, the different technologies. And we don't just leave one out because there are some special interests who think, let's not look at it because this is all right. I think we do not, none of that is fully understood at this moment, sufficiently fully understood. Or perhaps we have a full understanding, but then it's also helpful to bring that together through an authoritative report to indicating we have a good common understanding that the risks with that specific technology are not as big as they would need some specific governance around it. So I think using the broader term helps us to make sure that we don't neglect one of the area, that we have a good picture. But geoengineering has become, I think, for several, too negatively connotated term, and then at one moment terms can stay in the way of finding a solution.
Do you think this is something specifically with the English word, or might it sound different in other languages, Chinese, Spanish, French, Arabic, Russian? I mean, are these similar kind of terminological minefields perhaps there in other languages, or is this just because a peculiarity of the way we're using, people have used it?
No, I think we have the same problem in all the languages. Let's look like, for example, climate change. The term is challenged by saying this is too positive. You need to use the term climate crisis. And that's in English and in German and in French like that. There are many, that's a life of that each word is having, and each term after a certain moment develops negative and positive connotations. Sure. I think that's the same in all languages. It comes then interesting if you start to translate the same term, because while one term in English might have a very positive connotation, if you translate it in French, at once you might have a negative connotation for whatever cultural, social reasons that is linked to it. And then, of course, it becomes really interesting negotiating, because some want this term and the others the other one, for totally different reasons, because in their own language, there's a different connotation. And that's part, I think, also of the art of negotiating, of finding solutions that reflect what we want and not reflect all the possible connotations that with good or bad faith could be attached to a certain formulation.
Yeah. So based on this experience that you had at UNEA 4, what next steps did you take and Switzerland take to keep these discussions alive? I know, for example, you commissioned a report by the International Risk Governance Center on climate engineering. You know, what impact has that had? Where do we go from here?
Exactly. What we did afterwards, we three things. First of all, we continued the discussion with that group and with others outside about the importance of the topic, and that discussion, of course, continues, because we are still convinced that we all would benefit from such an assessment. I think that is a critical basis to creating an environment that gives us assurances for the future. On the second level, we tried to launch that study. We commissioned that study, which did a little bit what we hoped UNEP to do. And I think it is important that many of these studies will be undertaken. We are also supporting a study in Africa, for example, in that direction, so that also from a purely African perspective, you get a better understanding of the risks and opportunities and challenges linked to these technologies. Right. And we think these studies are important, but they cannot replace something that is then having the authority of a multilateral process. And the third element which we tried to do is also to create space within IPCC, with the current IPCC assessment, to look at the issue, but there it was not. We were not really succeeding in making sure that IPCC takes a sufficiently robust look at the issue of geoengineering. But even IPCC perspective will not be sufficient, because as indicated at the beginning, IPCC will always have a very important perspective, but it is one perspective. IPES might have a totally different perspective, or if you'd have an academic or a scientific institution looking at oceans only, they again might have a totally different perspective. What is important at the end, to bring these perspectives together, yes, and to make them, these perspectives, a kind of a authoritative perspective that is understood also as a global perspective.
In terms of some of the concerns you came across in FOEN, you mentioned how different groups had different types of concerns. Are you seeing that evolving in some ways? Obviously, people have had more time to think about some of these issues now, learning more, some of the discussion in wider society is advancing. Do you see these groups that you mentioned shifting? Is there, how are the concerns that you came across changing and evolving, and where are we today maybe on some of those?
Yes, I think things are evolving, but in the international process, things are not evolving in a very dramatic, rapid manner. I think we have to be aware that was the first time that the international community started to engage on that topic. And whenever you bring something for the first time, then first there are some concerns are created or woken up, because it's something new and you don't feel secure. You didn't have to have sufficient time to prepare yourself. You didn't have the time to consult with everybody at home. The debate at home might not be mature enough to have a clear position on that. Mm-hmm. So that when you table something like that the first time, that you do not only have enthusiastic support, I think that's understandable. And it's also understandable that since then, looking again at the proposal, also the broader debate that was initiated since then, all the debate, the work that was done by different fora, that including C2G2 and C2G2, you see, all these different debates have clearly helped to bring the thinking forward. And I'm sure if the same question comes up again, the understanding of the proposal will be much better. And also, that means also that the understanding where we could land together to reflect something that is building on and respecting and answering all the concerns of each of us. It's not something that should be only addressing the concern of one particular group of country. It should be clearly something that is at the end in the interest of everybody. And this needs time that everybody sees that this is in the interest of each of us.
So there's a lot of talk right now about sort of the intersection of science and public policy. We've been thinking about that a lot during the COVID times, and every country has got its own experience. When you mentioned about concerns, how do you see on starting to assess and think about these issues, how scientific advice and learning and all of that interacts with other political, economic, cultural factors and decision-making? Do you see any of those other factors coming to the fore on these carbon dioxide removal and solar radiation modification yet, or interested how you see that work out?
Well, I don't want to be misled by wishful thinking and wishful perception, of course. But I have the impression that in the different areas, I think at the end, most, if not everybody, believe that scientific understanding, scientific input is critical for sound policy making. So I think that nobody is challenging that really. And I think that people, actors increasingly understand that also in that area, where at the end behind there might be very fundamentally different interests, but each of them has at the end an interest that we have a better understanding. Yes. And so I hope that debate like that, framed like that, can also become a little bit de-emotionalized and depoliticized by saying we are not talking about politics now. We are talking about creating a common understanding that then allows later a policy debate.
Interesting. So there's some optimism there. I mean, are you optimistic that a multilateral agreement on this is possible? Some people have questioned, maybe this ends up being something that goes minilateral or other forms of. Do you feel that there's still something that multilateralism and that multilateral agreement on something as potentially contentious as some of these technologies is fundamentally possible?
I think multilateralism on these issues is not only possible, it's needed. It's the only way forward. I think if you are not able to address such challenges which have a global dimension through multilateralism, then we are having tremendous problems. Each of us, also the very big actors, will face problems at a certain moment if they do not work through multilateralism and based on multilateralism. So I think that's the only option we have. The question is, how fast will multilateralism be? Will it be fast enough to provide these assurances that we need, or will it be too slow? But I think multilateralism is the only option that we have.
And do you think, though, that there might be a risk that in the meantime, if it, given the speed issues you raise, that some countries could try to proceed unilaterally or in coalitions on some of these issues?
I think that risk exists. I believe that risk exists in some areas more than in others. But I'm not only here now with regard to geoengineering or climate intelligence and technology measures. I think that's in all policy areas, you always have that risk. And the biggest challenge is to explain and convince these actors who potentially could be in a position to go ahead, to show them that at the end it's also in their interest, not to go ahead, but to move together in a framework that at the end for the sustainability even of these actions will be important.
I mean, overall, this is a difficult sphere to work in, I think, probably for individuals emotionally. Generally, it can be sometimes a tendency to see despair in terms of the size of the challenge ahead and the willingness of countries to come together to deal with those challenges. And yet you also talked about optimism and maintain some sort of positive attitude that these things are going in the right direction. How do you maintain, how important is it for you to maintain a sense of optimism? But how do you do that whilst at the same time being honest about the gravity of the challenge? Right? Sometimes you could be so optimistic, almost denying the gravity of the challenge. How do you balance all of that on a personal level? And what advice do you have for people struggling with those issues?
I think two things are important. One is, of course, never to forget what objective is. But at the same time, not always focus on the objective. You always have to bear that in mind. But if you only focus on the objective and you have the impression you don't advance quickly to it, then you will be frustrated. You have also to see the small steps and the small successes you are achieving. And by also appreciating these small steps, then you realize that indeed we are approaching the objective. So we didn't succeed in having that resolution adopted at UNEA, but what we succeeded is to launch a tremendous discussion and debate. And that is a success. And so you have to build on that, on the perception. Yes, it was not a no. Things have changed thanks to our proposal. And perhaps we will not be able to get an assessment tomorrow or the day after, but we see a certain progress. And I think it is important also to be proud and glad about the small progresses we are able to achieve, despite the fact that the tremendous challenge still remains.
On that note, Franz Perrez, thank you very much for sharing your thoughts with us. It was a really fascinating discussion, and it's just beginning for many people. So thank you very much indeed, and we really look forward to seeing where all of this will go.
Thanks a lot, Mark. Thanks, it was a pleasure, and good luck with the other talks.